Arizona Territory, spring of 1878. The land was dry and wide and cruel, and so was the man who raised her. The sun beat down hard on the red dirt outside a crooked cabin 2 miles east of Fort Thomas, where 17-year-old Selah Kincaid stood barefoot in a worn calico dress, her fingers curled tight around the splintered post of the porch rail. Her father, Eli Kincaid, swung down off his mule and barked her name. "You'll be packed and ready by sundown," he said. "Trappers paid for you." Selah's stomach dropped. "What?" "Man's name is Jedediah Slade. Lives out by the Gila River. Traps pelts, trades with the army. Paid in silver and 2 mules." He spat into the dust. "Better than what your mother was worth." Her mouth went dry. "You cannot sell me." But her father had already turned his back. By nightfall, she was tied in the back of a freight wagon, her wrists raw and her eyes burning. The trapper didn't say much. He was thick-set with a cracked grin and a stink of whiskey. She heard him talking with her father before he left. Something about how a man needed a woman to cook, to clean, and to keep warm at night. The next morning, the desert opened wide ahead of them. Selah watched the sky for anything to change. But it just stayed blue and endless and full of heat. 2 days in, the wagon broke a wheel by the edge of a shallow creek. Slade cursed, kicked the wheel, then grabbed her by the arm and dragged her out. "Time we made our arrangement official," he growled. She fought. Dirt flew. Her nails caught the side of his face, left a red line. He slapped her hard, and she fell to her knees. The sound of her scream echoed across the basin. Then a voice, low and strong. "Let her go." Slade spun, hand to his rifle. A man stepped out from the brush. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with copper skin and black hair bound back with leather. His eyes were calm, but his stance promised violence. Behind him, 3 more riders waited at a distance. Slade laughed once. "Well now, you gonna trade for her too?" The man didn't answer. He only moved closer. Slade lifted his rifle. A sharp whistle cut the air and an arrow buried into the ground at Slade's feet. The man's riders had closed in fast, horses silent in the sand. One of them already had a bow drawn again. Slade backed away, muttering curses. Not worth it. He left, dragging the broken wagon wheel behind him, his pride bleeding faster than his cheek. The Apache man stepped forward. "Are you harmed?" he asked her, his voice low and even. Selah stared at him, chest heaving. He was going to. She stopped. "No, you stopped him." His eyes held hers. "I am Nantan, chief of my band. You do not need to fear now." Selah nodded once, throat tight. Then her knees gave out and she collapsed into the dust. When she woke, it was near dusk. She lay beneath a canvas shade, wrapped in a wool blanket, with the scent of sweet smoke and pine in the air. A small fire cracked nearby. The Apache man ran and sat across from her, sharpening a blade. His movements were quiet, careful. "You should eat," he said, without looking up. "I am not going back to him," she said. "You will not." She sat up slow. "Why did you help me?" He looked at her then. "Because no man owns a woman." Something in her chest cracked. She had never heard that before. She rode with them for 2 days. Nantan offered her space, but never distance. He watched her without pressure, spoke to her without pity. His people were kind, quiet strength in every gesture. They made camp in a hidden valley near the mountains where the spring water ran clear and the air cooled at night. Selah helped where she could. She picked herbs with one of the women, gathered wood, mended a torn cloak. At night, she sat near the fire and listened to the wind in the trees. On the 4th morning, Nantan approached her alone. "You have a choice," he said. "You are free." She swallowed. "And if I stay?" He looked at her a long moment. "Then you are still free." That night, she watched him from across the fire, the way his hands moved as he carved wood, how his eyes softened when he looked toward the stars. Something warm stirred in her. Days passed. Then more. Selah learned to ride without a saddle, to braid her hair against the wind, to laugh without flinching. And always Nantan was near. He never touched her without invitation, never pressed. But his presence wrapped around her like the mountain air, steady, strong, always there. One night, while they stood near the edge of camp, Watching the moon rise over the pines, she turned to him. "I never thought I would be safe again," she said. His eyes met hers. "You are safe." Her voice shook. "Do you want me to stay?" He took her hand gently in his. "Yes." She stepped closer. "Then I will." His forehead touched hers. No words, just breath and stillness and the quiet start of something whole. Weeks turned to months. The land shifted from spring to summer. Selah learned the rhythms of the people, their songs, their silences. Nantan taught her to track deer, to read weather in the sky. At night, they lay beside one another in their own shelter, her head on his chest, his hand in her hair. Once she asked him if he had ever meant to marry. "I never thought it possible," he said. "Until you." She smiled against his skin. "I never thought it safe." He kissed her then, slow, sure, full of everything neither of them had ever been allowed to hope for. They were married in the valley where he had first saved her. The ceremony was simple, sacred. His people sang. She wore a dress of soft doeskin, made by his sister. Nantan stood beside her, tall and steady, his eyes never leaving hers. Afterward, they walked alone to the place where the creek ran narrow and bright through the rocks. "I used to dream of running," she said. "Now I dream of staying." He brought her hand to his lips. "Then stay. Forever." She wrapped her arms around him. And there, beneath the wide Arizona sky, Selah Kincaid, once sold like a mule, found a love that was hers, and hers alone. The monsoon clouds rolled in late that summer, heavy and dark, their bellies swollen with rain. Selah stood at the edge of their planting field, her hands stained from pulling weeds, watching the sky twist above the distant ridges. She pressed one hand against her lower back where a dull ache had settled early that morning. Nantan approached from behind, his footfalls quiet on the damp earth. "Sky speaks of a long rain," he said, eyes on the horizon. She glanced sideways at him. "We still have time to cover the tobacco." He studied her for a breath, then nodded. "I'll send Tocho. You should rest." Selah bent again, stubborn. "I can finish." He crouched beside her. "You've done enough." Her lips pressed together, but she didn't argue. She let him take her basket, watched him walk it toward the drying rack before she turned toward the shelter. There was a stillness to the air, the kind that pressed against the skin before a storm. Inside, she lit the oil lamp and sat cross-legged on the woven mat, her fingers trailing along the edge of the beaded pouch she'd started 2 days before. The design was meant to resemble the jagged peaks to the north, but her stitches weren't even. She frowned and picked one out with her needle. By nightfall, the wind had begun to whip through the trees, and thunder grumbled low across the mountains. Rain came in steady sheets, tapping against the hide walls, pooling outside the threshold. Nantan returned wet to the knees, his braid clinging to his shoulder. "They've moved the horses higher," he said, hanging his cloak. "The stream's rising fast." Selah reached for a dry cloth. "You're soaked through." He knelt, letting her press the fabric against his arms. His skin was cool. She traced a scar she hadn't noticed before, high on his forearm, pale and jagged. "What was this from?" she asked. "Winters ago. A bull elk cornered and afraid. I was young." She ran her thumb along its ridge. "You were lucky. I was foolish." He met her gaze. "But I learned." She didn't look away. "So did I." He took her hand and pressed it to his chest. For a long while, the storm carried all the sound between them, and neither spoke. The next morning, the world smelled of wet sage and pine. Mud sucked at their boots as they walked to the stream's edge. The water had swallowed the lower trail, and driftwood lay tangled in the brush. A few chickens from the nearby shelter had scattered during the night, and Selah helped the younger women coax them back with grain. Later, she found Nantan smoothing a length of cedar with a knife, carving notches along its edge. She knelt beside him and watched the shavings curl. "What will it be?" she asked. "A cradle board." Her breath caught. He glanced at her sideways. "You've been quiet these past days. I thought you might tell me." Selah didn't speak right away. She picked up one of the cedar curls and rolled it between her fingers, her voice low when it came. I wasn't sure. You are now. She nodded once. 2 moons. He set the knife down and placed his hand over hers. You are not alone. I know that, she said. But I still don't know what kind of mother I'll be. You will be the kind who listens, who watches the sky and knows when to bring the tobacco in. His voice held no humor, only calm certainty. You will be the kind who teaches how to stand even when the wind comes hard. Selah's throat tightened. I don't have much to pass on. You have everything, he said. The morning passed in quiet labor. She stitched while he shaped the frame. By midday, the sun peeked through breaks in the cloud cover, and the earth began to steam. They took a meal beneath the cottonwoods, sharing fry bread and dried berries, their knees touching. That evening, a rider arrived from the West Ridge, carrying word that a trader from Tucson would be passing by in 3 days. Nantan listened carefully, then nodded and turned to Selah. You've spoken of wanting to write your sister. If you still wish it, I'll have him carry your letter. She blinked, caught off guard. You remembered. I remember everything you tell me. She smiled faintly, then looked down at her hands. I don't know what I'll say. It's been years. Write only what is true. She considered that, then nodded. I will. As night fell, they walked to the ridge where the stars came out first. She leaned into his side, her hand resting over the place where life now stirred. I didn't think I'd ever make a home, she whispered. He looked at her, his face lined with quiet wonder. You didn't make it alone. She touched his cheek. No. I didn't. They stood there until the moon rose and the wind shifted, and all around them the land breathed in peace. The trader arrived just after dawn, his mule-laden cart creaking beneath the weight of flour, lye soap, and bolts of cotton cloth. He wore a long duster and carried a ledger tucked under his arm, but his eyes were kind and he greeted Nantan with a quiet nod before setting up beneath the pinyon trees near the eastern ridge. Selah brought him a cup of boiled coffee and handed over the letter she had written to her sister, folded with care and sealed inside a scrap of oiled paper. The name's Corwin, the trader said, taking the letter with a respectful dip of his head. I'll see it to Fort Bowie and into the post myself. Thank you, Selah said. She won't be expecting it. He gave a slow blink. Some of the best words are the ones we don't expect. She watched him tuck the letter into a pouch on his belt, then turned back toward the shelter, her fingers brushing her lower belly through the fabric of her dress. The child had begun to stir more often, especially at night. As she walked, the wind carried the quiet rhythm of Nantan's voice as he spoke to one of the younger boys outside the horse enclosure, instructing him in the repair of a broken halter. That afternoon, Nantan joined her by the fire pit where she was preparing hominy. He crouched beside her and set down a small clay jar. Red earth from the canyon beyond the south bend, he said. It's used to mark the cradle board before the child is placed inside. Selah took the jar carefully, turning it in her hands. I thought the carving was finished. It is, but the earth is part of the blessing. It binds the child's spirit to the land. She looked at him, something steady blooming in her chest. Will you show me how to use it? He nodded once. At moonrise, evening settled slow, the sky stretching wide in pale lavender and rose. Selah walked with Nantan into the grove where the cradleboard rested on a woven mat, the cedar polished to a soft sheen. He dipped 2 fingers into the jar and pressed a line of red across the top of the board, then handed it to her. She mirrored his gesture, careful and reverent. Each mark is a promise, he murmured. To protect, she asked. Yes, but also to remember. Who we are. Where we came from. She let her fingers rest against the final mark. Then I will remember. They stood together in silence, surrounded by the hush of wind through pine needles and the faint rustle of a night bird overhead. When they returned to the shelter, he lit the small lamp and sat with her on the mat, his back against the wall, his legs outstretched. I dreamed last night, he said, voice low. Selah leaned her head against his shoulder. What did you see? You standing in the river, holding our child. The water was high, but you didn't move. You were singing. She turned her face toward his chest, her fingers curling against the folds of his shirt. I've never sung in front of anyone. You will, he answered gently. A few days later, they rode north to a high valley where Nantan's uncle kept a stand of fruit trees. The air was cooler there, the soil darker. Young apricots hung heavy on the branches, not yet ripe. Selah walked slowly between the rows, her hand grazing the leaves. Nantan knelt beside a fallen limb, inspecting a split in the bark. The frost came early this year, he said. She crouched beside him, wincing slightly as she shifted. Will it harm the fruit? Not if it holds through the next full moon. She traced the edge of the wound on the branch. Things survive even with breaks. He looked at her, then his eyes unreadable. They do. Before they returned to the valley, Nantan's uncle gave Selah a bundle of dried herbs and a pouch of powdered root. For the birth, he said, his voice lined with age. Steep this with warm water when the pain begins. She took it with both hands. Thank you. He nodded, then turned to Nantan. You chose well. Nantan said nothing, but his hand touched the small of her back as they walked away. That night, Selah lay awake long after the fire had burned low, her fingers resting over the curve of her belly. Nantan stirred beside her, his breath even, one arm draped loosely around her waist. She whispered into the dark. I used to be afraid of sleeping. His voice came quiet but sure. You don't need to be. I'm not, she said. Not anymore. Outside, the wind carried the scent of wild sage across the valley floor, and the stars above wheeled slow and certain over the desert they now called home. The child came in early autumn, just after the chokecherries had been gathered and the valley took on the scent of dry grass and cold stone. Selah's labor began before first light, steady and slow, and by the time the sun slipped past the ridgeline, she was gripping the poles of their shelter with both hands, sweat cooling on her neck despite the heat of the fire. Nantan never left her side. One of the elder women, Lhasa, tended the birth with quiet assurance, her hands practiced and sure. She spoke little, only what needed saying. When the pain surged, Selah leaned into Nantan's shoulder, her breath hot against his collarbone. You are strong, he said, his voice even. You are not alone. She didn't cry out, not once. When the child slipped into the world, slick and red and furious with life, Selah's eyes filled, but the tears never fell. Lhasa laid the baby against her chest, wrapped in soft cloth dyed with walnut husk. A girl, heavy-limbed and quiet now, her fingers curled into the folds of Selah's dress. Nantan pressed his forehead to Selah's temple. She is ours, he whispered. Selah nodded, her arms tightening around the child. She is. That night, after the fire had gone to embers and the others had left them in peace, he placed the marked cradleboard beside their bed. Selah touched the polished cedar, then looked at him. What will we call her? He watched the baby, his expression thoughtful. She came with the cold wind, but there is fire in her hands. Let her carry both. Selah brushed a thumb across the child's brow. Then she will be called Nehemina, she who walks with both. He smiled, slow and deep, then kissed her once, just below the ear. The days that followed were quiet, but full. Selah moved slowly, her body still tender from the birth. She took to carrying Nehemina in a sling Nantan's sister had sewn for her, lined with soft rabbit fur. The baby slept often, curled against her breast with a contented sigh that reminded Selah of rain on dry earth. The valley shifted with the season. Leaves turned brittle and gold. Wild turkeys traced narrow paths through the brush. One morning, Selah found Nantan splitting cedar planks behind the shelter, the sun warming his bare shoulders. What are you making? She asked. He didn't look up. Something for the winter. You'll see. She knelt beside him, setting Nehemina down on a blanket. The baby wriggled, fussed once, then quieted. Selah watched her husband's hands, the way his knife moved with purpose. I used to think men like you only lived in stories, she said. His knife paused. And now? She reached out and ran her fingers along the edge of the board he'd shaped. Now I know better. That evening, he brought her a small cedar box with a sliding lid. Inside were 6 tiny wooden animals: deer, bear, rabbit, eagle, wolf, and turtle, all carved with detail and care. For her, he said. When she is older. Selah looked up at him, heartful. You carved each one by hand. Each night after the fire burned low, she placed her hand over his. I think she'll remember. As weeks passed, they settled deeper into rhythm. Selah rose before the sun, swaddled Nehemina close, and gathered what roots and berries still lingered. Nantan taught her how to prepare dried meat with juniper ash, how to smoke it so it kept through the cold months. They built a second shelter, smaller, for storage and tools. Neighbors came and went, bringing venison, laughter, news of distant kin. One afternoon, a boy from the southern trail brought word that the army had passed near the river bend, headed west. Nantan listened, then nodded once, his eyes unreadable. Selah waited until the boy had gone. Will they come near? No. They follow the rail line. They do not trouble these hills anymore. She rocked Nehemina gently in her arms. Do they ever ask about women like me? They do not see what they cannot claim. Selah said nothing, but a quiet breath left her lungs. That night, she stood outside while Nantan finished mending a saddle strap. Nehemina slept nearby, bundled in her cradleboard. The stars were sharp above, the air cold enough to bite. Selah stared at the sky, her arms wrapped around her middle. I thought once I'd be forgotten, she said. Nantan looked up. You feared that. I did. She turned to him. But now I think I'd rather be known by a few and known well. He came to her then, wrapped his arms around her from behind. You are known. She leaned into him, eyes closing. And I know you. They stood that way until the cold chased them inside, and the fire crackled back to life. In the weeks that followed, Nehemina's eyes opened wide and alert. Her fists no longer clenched, and her gaze followed light across the wall. Selah began to hum as she worked, soft tunes she made up as she went. Nantan never interrupted, though he listened with a stillness that said her voice mattered. On the first snow, they brought the cradleboard to the ridge above the valley. Selah held Nehemina close, the child wrapped in a quilt stitched from old tradecloth and deer hide. Nantan stood beside them, his hand resting lightly on Selah's back. The snow fell in quiet flakes, catching in their hair, dusting the cradleboard. Selah looked out across the land. She will walk this place. She will know its name, Nantan said. They stayed until the snow thickened, then turned back toward the firelight, their daughter nestled between them, their footsteps soft and sure in the powder behind them. By the turn of the year, the snow had settled deep across the ridges, and the stream behind the shelter froze over in places, its song muffled beneath ice. Selah rose each morning before pale light reached the valley floor, wrapping Nehemina in a wool shawl and warming stones in the hearth to line her cradleboard. Nantan kept the firewood stacked high and the traps checked with quiet diligence, his boots leaving narrow tracks through the snow that Selah could follow with her eyes from the doorway. The days were hushed, filled with small labors and the rhythm of a life earned, not given. Selah had taken to drying strips of squash above the fire and stitching a long quilt from salvaged cloth she traded for a jar of honey and a packet of tobacco leaves. She'd begun to teach herself the stitchwork patterns she saw on the garments worn by the older women, tracing each shape with a needle until the motion settled into her fingers like memory. One afternoon, while Nehemina napped, Selah sat outside with a pair of soft deerskin booties in her lap. Nantan knelt nearby, oiling the leather of a saddle he was repairing for a neighbor's cousin. Do you think she'll walk early? Selah asked, glancing toward the shelter where their daughter slept. She watches everything, he answered. I think she will walk as soon as she wants to. Selah smiled slightly, pressing the needle through the heel with care. I used to think wanting something wasn't enough. He looked over at her, the wind tugging at the ends of his braid. It isn't always, but sometimes it's where the path begins. She set the booty aside and leaned back on her hands. I never told you what I used to dream of before. I'd like to know. There was a house with a red roof. Just a small one, nothing fancy. But it was mine. No one could take it. And I'd plant things. Beans mostly. Maybe a tree, if there was enough water. He didn't answer right away. Then, there's a bend south of here, past the dry arroyo. The soil's darker there. You could plant beans. And a tree. She looked at him, breath catching against the cold air. You'd build a roof? He nodded once. Red if you want. She reached for his hand, bare and warm despite the wind. I want it because it's ours. When the snow began to melt in slow patches and the ground softened underfoot, Nantan brought her to the place he'd spoken of. The arroyo had dried to a trickle and the hillside beyond it opened into a gentle slope. Selah knelt where the earth darkened and crumbled in her palm. It's good soil, she said. We can start laying the foundation after the last frost, he said. I'll bring stone from the northern ridge. I'll start gathering seed. They stayed until the sun began to drop, then turned back toward the shelter, their daughter nestled between them on Nantan's back, her small head resting against his shoulder. In the weeks that followed, their neighbors came to help clear the plot. Logs were hauled, stones fitted, and beams lifted one by one. Selah worked alongside them, hammering pegs and hauling water, her body lean and strong from seasons of labor. The house rose slowly, each board fitted with care. The roof was finished last, painted with crushed clay and ochre powder until it shone red against the blue sky. On the day they moved in, Selah stood in the doorway holding Nehemina, her eyes tracing the beams she and Nantan had raised together. She'll remember this, Selah said. She already knows its walls, he replied. They laid the baby in her cradle beside the hearth and sat together on the woven rug Selah had stitched through the long winter. Outside, the wind rustled the early leaves and the scent of warm earth drifted through the open window. Selah turned to him, her voice steady. I never thought I'd have a place that couldn't be taken. He reached for her hand, fingers threading through hers. You built it. So did you. He kissed her, then not quick, not tentative, but with the full weight of all they'd endured and chosen. It wasn't a promise. It didn't need to be. They had already kept everyone. In the years that followed, the house stood firm against desert winds and season turns. Nehemina learned to crawl, then walk, then run barefoot across the packed earth behind the house. Selah planted beans and corn in rows that curved like riverbanks. Nantan carved her a bench beneath the cottonwood, where she read letters from her sister, who wrote back after all, asking forgiveness and offering her own. They hosted neighbors in the spring, shared venison stew and sweetbread, and filled the small porch with laughter and the smell of sage smoke. In the evenings, when the sun dropped behind the ridges and the shadows stretched long, Nantan would lift Nehemina onto his shoulders and walk the fence line with Selah's hand tucked into his. Selah no longer feared sleep. She no longer looked over her shoulder when the wind changed. She had a name that was hers, a child with eyes like firelight, a man who had never asked for more than she was willing to give and who had given her everything in return. And she had a red-roofed home that would stand long after they were gone, built from stone, sweat, and the quiet, unshakable love that had saved them both. Together they lived, not just safely, but fully, and always side by side.